Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. The Dalai Lama has said that he will die in India and his reincarnation cannot be recognized in an environment which does not have freedom, a clear reference to China. The topic of reincarnation has been a burning issue since China considers the spiritual leader as a splittist, a charge denied by the 14th Dalai Lama. Speaking at an Indian Express event on Wednesday, the Dalai Lama held forth on a variety of questions ranging from prevention of, preservation of Tibetan culture, I beg your pardon, to life on another planet. Asked about the future of the Dalai Lama as an institution, he said that as early as in 1969, he had stated that it was a decision which would have to be taken by his people. The 81-year-old, however, said that some time back they decided that when his age reaches around 90 years, they would have a more serious discussion on the issue. On this edition of The Big Picture, analyze the implications of the statements of the Dalai Lama and discuss about the future of the institution of the Dalai Lama. Joining me on the program today are Raviprasad Narayanan, Associate Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU, Suresh K. Goel, former diplomat, Pramit Chaudhuri, Foreign Editor, Hindustan Times, and Aditya Mukherjee, Professor, Center for Historical Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Pramit, I'd like to start with you. Of course, what do you make of the statements of the Dalai Lama a couple of days ago?
Well, to some degree, he's iterating what he's already said before, which is that the Dalai Lama, the next Dalai Lama, would not have to be born in Tibet. That he could be reborn as a full-grown adult rather than as a baby. And a lot of what his actions have been consistently going around to, whether it's Arunachal Pradesh, going to Mongolia, is to get the local sort of Rinpoches, the Buddhist leaders and those, to endorse this point of view. So that he's now come out and sort of put this together further and said, given a timeline, 8 years from now roughly, and further stated that it has to be done in an environment that, as you've mentioned, effectively excludes China, I think is further strengthening and consolidating a line that he's already taken beforehand. He has also indicated before that he would have preferred that the Tibetans move on to a democratic government in exile and have an elected leader as their leadership, but he understands that right now Tibetans, if you ask them, they're very clear. The Dalai Lama is the leader of their people, of them, and the Prime Minister, President, government of exile is only there at the sufferance of the Dalai Lama as far as they are concerned.
Right, indeed. You know, Raviprasad Narayanan, as far as the Dalai Lama's statements were concerned, there was a clear reference to China in all of this, wasn't it?
Yes, there was. But one has to bear in mind that His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, has actually been bringing out statements over several decades, saying that at one level he may be the last Dalai Lama, but at the same time there is a process, an institutionalized process, if one might call it, within the Tibetan framework as to how the next Dalai Lama has to be found. And the final word rests with the current Dalai Lama, and this can only happen, God forbid, after the current Dalai Lama exits. And that way, the Dalai Lama has actually maintained the momentum as long as maintaining the confusion when it comes to the next Dalai Lama. And the people most uncertain about what is going to happen is going to be the Chinese side.
Okay. Chinese too are moving in their own direction. Ambassador, they're saying that we are going to choose the next Dalai Lama. They've even said that the next Dalai Lama will be chosen by lots. So, I mean, the Chinese keep bringing up this issue time and again. And, you know, what kind of implications really do you think that these statements are going to have?
All that I recall is that there was a legend quite some time ago that 14th Dalai Lama would be the last Dalai Lama. It's a story. It's just a legend, really. And the amazing thing is that the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, does not refute that legend. There was a discussion, I recall, not yesterday, but around a week or 10 days ago, again, where Mr. Arun Shourie was the presiding deity over the launch of a book in IIC, where actually Dalai Lama questioned the continuation of the institution of lamas. because in his mind, the Lamas had become really what Buddhism didn't want, a hardened ritualism, rather than permitting cross-examination and thought. So what I find is that as Dalai Lama is becoming older, so to say, but I think his thinking is becoming increasingly clear, whether there is any need, so to say, for the continuation of the institution. That is number one. Number two, when he says that it cannot happen in the environment where there is no freedom, etc., 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 and so on and so forth, he is quite clear that the next Dalai Lama does not have to come from Tibet. But he is also very clear that the selection of the Dalai Lama has to be done by Tibetans. So if it is not done by Tibetans, it is not Dalai Lama. So Chinese may bring in the Dalai Lama by laws or whatever it is, but whether the Dalai Lama would be acceptable to Tibetans is entirely a different matter. So I think what we are seeing is a debate now on the continuity of the institution of Dalai Lama as such, the role of Dalai Lama in the Tibetan affairs as the head of the government, as the head of the administration, etc., etc., etc. And I think that's a very, very different kind of a debate than what we have seen in the past.
Sure, fair enough. Professor Mukherjee, is it the end of the road as far as the institution of the Dalai Lama is concerned, or as Pramit has pointed out, that the people are really not ready and so the institution is going to continue?
No, I don't think it is the end of the road at all for the institution. And the Dalai Lama himself is taking a grey picture in this, not a black and white thing. I mean, he is, as you know, is very radical in his thinking. He even claims that he was a Marxist. But he's one of the most brilliant, in my opinion, statesmen who's keeping alive the aspirations of a people against a regime which can be enormously ruthless. So to keep alive a movement, a people, an aspiration at a time when they can be wiped out is a very tough choice. And in the statement that you have quoted, you see this dilemma. So on the one hand, the only way he can keep it alive is freedom within China. On the other hand, he never goes too far and says we want freedom from China. He's years ago said that that's not our demand. Our demand is only autonomy, cultural freedom, etc., etc. So he's walking a very difficult path. And in that, I don't think he's going to take a position that now is the time to end the institution of the Lamas. It will only be when it is possible, when the situation has so evolved, that the Tibetan people have so evolved that you can think of it. That doesn't seem to be the case at the moment at all.
Sure, yes, Ambassador.
Counterpoint. I don't think Dalai Lama has ever said that he can bring the institution to an end. But I think what is happening is that if the next Dalai Lama cannot be chosen by Tibetans, that would probably automatically bring to an end. I don't want to call it an end, but the institution of Dalai Lama will not be that acceptable to Tibetans and probably will not be that effective in keeping them together as a community, religious community, or that's what is happening.
Sure, sure. Pramit, are the Chinese just waiting for the inevitable, to happen? Let's not forget that the Dalai Lama is 81 years old now, and he's probably on his last leg, though he's moving around, as anyone else would. So are the Chinese just waiting for the inevitable really to move things forward as far as they are concerned?
Yeah, so far they seem to be slowly developing all of the requirements, the prerequisites to launch their own Dalai Lama. I would expect that we will soon have, probably within a decade, 2 Dalai Lamas, one based in China and one based in India. And there will be a sort of struggle for, I wouldn't say legitimacy, because Tibetans will accept only the one that's here. But there will be a battle because China will use its diplomatic and economic clout to force the international community to accept their Dalai Lama. But the Chinese, if you look at their policies, they've already said, for example, a few years ago, they said that reincarnation is something that would be controlled by Chinese government diktat. That's very bizarre for a communist regime, but they put that into their regulation, that's saying avatars and everything comes under us. The party decides. And they've been slowly holding World Buddhist conferences. They made the argument to China, to Japan and Korea and other countries that the Buddhism you practice is actually of Chinese origin. And they've been trying to slowly argue that more or less almost everything about Buddhism is effectively centered in Beijing. So this sort of little cultural war that they're struggling with, at the heart of it lies the question of trying to control the Tibetan Dalai Lama succession.
Fair enough. You know, Raviprasad, Narayan, the issue really, as far as the Dalai Lama is concerned, we've spoken about it over the last 10 minutes or so, talking about how the institution really is here to stay, and the Tibetan people will eventually want the institution to continue. So the Dalai Lama doesn't really choose a successor. You know, what then happens? Is it a process of selection? Do the other lamas really choose a Dalai Lama? What exactly will happen then?
Precisely, Frank. Because over the last couple of years, what we have noticed is that the Tibetan government in exile, the Prime Minister, has now been elevated to become the regent. And in history, we have seen that the regent plays a very important role in the not only selection, but also the identifying the next Dalai Lama. So the current Prime Minister in exile, he will ultimately be responsible in leading the team that will identify the next Dalai Lama, depending upon the words left behind by the current Dalai Lama, when that day comes. Secondly, if you look at it, why are the Chinese so, I would say, apprehensive about the Dalai Lama? Primarily because this is a party state that claims that it doesn't believe in religion, but has a population that is seeking an outlet in the form of religion. And Tibetan there. So to the Communist Party in Beijing, the Dalai Lama is the alternative. You have an atheist state at one level, but which, if it allows the Dalai Lama to grow, the whole edifice could be challenged, which is where they would want to impose themselves when it comes to the selection or the identifying of the next Dalai Lama, and they would prefer that the whole issue gets muddy, just like what happened to the Panchen Lama.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very valid point that you're making. And, you know, Ambassador, as far as India is concerned, you know, it is important for the institution to continue because, you know, the Chinese have always said that India is leveraging the Dalai Lama or using the Dalai Lama to create tension, to create trouble. But when you have a hegemonic China, on the other hand, you have to have some kind of leverage. And the institution of the Dalai Lama is great for the Indians, isn't it?
Look, Frank, I think this emphasis on Tibet card is really overplayed. There is no Tibet card as such that India has. You see, if you look at what in fact, I wanted to comment on that point myself. What is this whole thing about really Dalai Lama about? The whole movement really is Dalai Lama institution supports or actually is able to get a huge international support in favor of the Tibetan demand for autonomy. If you look at what is happening in Tibet today, you will see that that kind of a demand politically or in reality does not mean anything at all, because Tibetan has become so much Sinicized, Hanized, or whatever you want to call it. It's huge. It's a huge difference. If you read the reports coming from Tibet, you go to Lhasa, it's unrecognizable. Therefore, in that sense, the transformation of Tibet has taken place. It's continuing. So even if you talk about a Tibetan autonomy, it will be a Chinese Tibet really that is in place. Okay, that is Tibet as far as is concerned. Then we come to Tibetans who are in exile, who are living abroad. How many of those in exile are or would want to go back to Tibet? They have found a profession wherever they are. USA, India, China, wherever they are, they have found a profession. At the moment, what we see really is Tibetan in exile holding on to and demand for a Tibetan Buddhist kind of an entity, which is synonymous with Dalai Lama. If Dalai Lama does not, God forbid, I mean, we are not, but would we have the same kind of a Tibetan in exile movement after Dalai Lama? My sense is that the moral force that the Dalai Lama exists will not be there anymore to keep them together. So there will be a huge impact on the movement as it is. And we are seeing that movement actually now coming up, that kind of a thing coming up. So what kind of a Tibet or influence Tibet card are we talking about? I'm sorry, no, India does not play the Tibet card. We could have thought about 40 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever it is, but not anymore. So we don't have that kind of a leverage as far as relations with China are concerned.
Sure, fair enough. Professor Mukherjee, you know, this is the 14th Dalai Lama. Of course, we've spoken about the 15th Dalai Lama and, you know, the possibilities of a 15th Dalai Lama. But as far as the elevation of a Dalai Lama is concerned, how has it happened over time, over the last few centuries, of a few thousand years, in fact?
I'm not an expert on that, but I'd like to comment on the last point that you made on India using Tibet as a leverage. I don't think it was ever done. Even when the Dalai Lama first came, there was a lot of hesitation in even allowing him to come here. The reason why the Tibetans were allowed to come was the general Indian policy, which has been from the beginning right through, is to allow refugees, political, sort of victims from other countries. So, but it has never been. China took it in that manner, and it is said, they are the experts, that one of the reasons that suggested for the 62 attack was perhaps China's perception that we were using it. But I don't think that it would be correct to say that India has tried to use this as a leverage. But India's position on this, certainly with the Dalai Lama, is that the Dalai Lama is probably the most sober, moderate influence on those who want to save the Tibetan people, their identity.
Sure.
Because the alternative, as we are seeing all over the world, would be disastrous. And that is why something like the Dalai Lama, the institution of the Dalai Lama, guided by him, would be probably in the interest of the world, and certainly the way India would look towards, rather than make any drastic changes or allow communist countries to suddenly, put in religious or create religious leaders. These are very dangerous things. When people who are not in the business of doing that try to create religious leaders, that is not going to work. It's going to lead to further alienation of those who are in exile or of the Tibetan people as a whole. So I think it is in our interest, and that is the way the Indians have looked at it, is support to the Dalai Lama not as an anti-China move, but as a move which keeps alive the Tibetan people's aspirations, but in a manner which is acceptable to the world, including to China, and to persuade China to do it in a manner that would be acceptable to everybody.
Fair enough. I think that's a very valid point that you've just made. Pramit, taking the discussion forward and talking about the aspirations really of the Tibetan people, can the institution of the Dalai Lama really take that forward? Of course, we've seen the kind of work that the present Dalai Lama has done over the years. He's done tremendous work for the Tibetan people and for propagating peace around the world as well, and everything that he's done. But can a new Dalai Lama really take that forward? Can the aspirations of the people be met?
It will be a very difficult task, because this Dalai Lama obviously has an enormous degree of credibility and legitimacy with Tibetans today. And if there is a second Dalai Lama, no matter whether it's supported by China, he's supported by China or not, there will be some division in Tibetan ranks. It's not as if all Tibetans support the Dalai Lama. The Shukden groups and others are anti-Dalai Lama and have been for a long time. So it will be a difficult task. And the Dalai Lama, as has been mentioned earlier, would very much like the spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet to effectively be united at some point, because he sees that as the future. He doesn't want to recreate, as has been mentioned earlier, the theological Tibetan kingdoms of the past. He's very clear that he thinks that those are obsolete and should never be resurrected. But his focus, has also been mentioned, is really about trying to preserve Tibetan culture as much as is possible, not in terms of trying to get independence, which he accepts as at present is not going to happen for the foreseeable future. So the next Dalai Lama will have an immense task on his job. And the preference would be, by using the Tibetan government in exile in combination with the next Dalai Lama, you'll have an institutional structure that supports him, rather than just having one single individual, in other words, a sort of personality cult trying to drive or maintain the Tibetan cause. And that's going to be extraordinarily tricky. And I think that's one of the reasons I think the Dalai Lama wants to keep postponing this as long as he possibly can, because he really needs time to slowly get this idea not only put together, but to have it accepted by his own people, who continue to be relatively, ambiguous about the government in exile. I'll just add one thing about the Tibetan card. The fact is that we have a Tibetan card. We use it very lightly. But I'll give you a simple anecdote. In 2009, when China introduced the Kashmir visa, stapled visas for Kashmiris, India responded angrily. China basically said, we don't care what you think. India did a number of things, including massively expanding its military exercises with the United States, carrying out other diplomatic and economic actions. We expelled 23,000 Chinese in 1 year. China was completely unmoved. It only began to move when our ambassador in China made a speech in China saying that if this continues, if China changes its policy on Kashmir, we are prepared to change our policy on Tibet. Then at the foreign secretary meetings in Sichuan in 2010, I think it was, this was openly, explicitly told to the Chinese behind closed doors. At that point, the Kashmir visa policy was reversed. It was the only thing that the Chinese were nervous about.
And that's the only thing that deter the Chinese, really, as far as the issue at hand is concerned. Time now to get closing comments from all my guests, starting, of course, with Raviprasad Narayan. As far as the next Dalai Lama is concerned, Raviprasad Narayan, are we going to see a process of reincarnation, selection, or emanation? What's it really going to be?
I think firstly the next Dalai Lama should be legitimate in the eyes of the Tibetan people, because the current Dalai Lama has very clearly separated the spiritual and the temporal aspects. So the next Dalai Lama would exclusively be looking after the spiritual realm of the Tibetan community at large. So that is where the legitimacy comes. Secondly, it is how much needling can the Chinese do when it comes to the legitimacy of the next Dalai Lama. If the next Dalai Lama is to be from China proper, as we know it, the Chinese are going to dispute the whole process, delegitimize the whole institution of the Dalai Lama, and basically muddy the whole situation, as I had mentioned before. So that is where we are.
Sure, fair enough. Ambassador, your closing comments on the program?
Program?
Yeah, as far as the...
Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. No, I think basically what we are now seeing are very, very critical times for the institution of Dalai Lama, for the future of the movement of Tibetan autonomy. I think whoever the next Dalai Lama is, however he is selected, the main thing is going to remain really for the, the Dalai Lama, Chinese Dalai Lama, Tibetan Dalai Lama, etc., to basically fight or contest for the legitimacy of the institution of Dalai Lama. And that contest is going to be so time consuming, so energy consuming. I suspect that the real issue of Tibet is going to be sidetracked.
Okay, fair enough. Professor Mukherjee, your closing.
Yeah, I'd go along with what Pramit was saying. The Dalai Lama himself, when he happened to be, it was just a historical chance that he happened to be a religious leader who was outstanding also as the political leader of his people. But he is very conscious that this is not the way the thing should be. And therefore, the future of this institution actually depends a lot on how this Dalai Lama is going to behave on this question. And he's very aware of the huge burden of this responsibility. And therefore, he's perhaps going cautiously, as you're saying, he's delaying it. He's saying, when I'm 90, he's giving him already 9 years, So he's going to take his time. And it would be in order, again, speaking globally and looking at the future, of course, it will be in order that these two functions are separated. But how to bring about an institutional structure which also has China's approval, is such a big ask. That it's very difficult for us to say anything on that.
Sure. Pramit, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I'll just say that one of the reasons why China actually still likes the concept of the Dalai Lama, the institution of the Dalai Lama, even though they'd want to have one of their own, is that Chinese are also interestingly nervous. When I talk to Chinese officials and academics, that they said the one good thing about the Dalai Lama, of course, is that he's a pacifist. Unlike the violence we see in Xinjiang, Tibet, we don't see violence. I mean, there's occasional stray incidents, but the Dalai Lama is the first person to tell his people, nobody kills Han Chinese, nobody does anything. And they are also very clear that if the institution of the Dalai Lama disintegrates, the possibility of violence in Tibet increases, which gets them even more nervous than the possibility of having an independent Dalai Lama.
Sure, fair enough. Very well summed up there. On that note, we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Raviprasad, Narayanan, Suresh K. Goel, Pramit Pal, Chaudhuri, Aditya, Mukherjee. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the program and bringing things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have. See you again on Monday.